I'm a climate change and cities consultant at Arup, and I work a lot with city and local governments to achieve their zero carbon strategies. We also look a lot at offsetting and carbon pricing mechanisms to help them achieve that. I'm probably going to echo quite a lot of what James and Stallard have said, but ultimately I think there's sort of two key reasons why offsetting schemes don't work as they currently are. Although there are elements of existing offsetting schemes, such as the local government funds that have been spoken about here in London, which could work alongside regulatory mechanisms such as carbon tax to really drive decarbonisation in the really hard to reach areas of the built environment. So I'm thinking the existing residential housing sector. So sort of two main reasons I'm going to touch on as to why offsetting schemes don't currently work is the first is around the impact. So ultimately, offsetting schemes to work to sort of counter emissions produced by large polluters, by individuals or even organisations. So for many years, large polluters have justified the purchasing of offsets in other countries to reduce the emissions against a baseline scenario. So they're in addition. But under the Paris Agreement, these activities are no longer additional, but absolutely necessary, as we want countries to achieve their NDCs. And second to that, even with the best intentions, often these offsetting schemes aren't achieving the emission reductions they think they should. The EU Commission recently looked at the Clean Development Mechanism, which is one of the first original offsetting schemes, and it recognised that 85% of those projects weren't achieving the emissions reductions that they actually set out to achieve in the first place. The second key point around why I don't think offsetting schemes currently work is the kind of diversion of the conversation. So it's moving the conversation away from achieving zero carbon or even net negative emissions, which is what we ultimately need to reverse the current impact of high levels of emissions we have in the atmosphere. So offsetting doesn't achieve this, and in fact, the actual surplus of offsetting schemes that are starting to appear more and more has acted to kind of keep the price of carbon at a real rock bottom level. So we're talking about $1 a tonne. Now, research by the likes of the IPCC and the EPA has identified that the impact of 1 tonne of carbon can be anywhere from $11 all the way up to $200 a tonne. And I think the problem is in celebrating the kind of proactive nature of the kind of top companies who have started very early offsetting schemes or even internal carbon pricing mechanisms has just kind of allowed them to monopolise the conversation on offsetting. And it's sort of diverted attention away from the lack of regulation on some of these industries. So sort of trying to name too many people, but for example, EasyJet has announced an amazing plan to offset all their emissions, and it's going to cost them $25 million. They're under a no tax regime. They make $6.4 billion a year. It's very, very little. We need a system that really promotes actual absolute reduction and works locally. So picking up on James's point, the experience I have with city governments is that cities do really want to achieve their zero carbon strategies, but they're struggling to offset emissions, particularly with their public infrastructure. And they're also having to offset emissions that industries that really shouldn't be responsible for. So I'm thinking those cities where they might have shipping industry or airports existing, they're having to offset emissions from flights taking off and landing under 1,800 feet. That should be the responsibility of those industries. So we've spoken a bit about local government funds, and actually carbon taxes along with local government funds can work at the project level, the portfolio level, or even the industry level. And those funds can be directed into tackling the really hard to reach areas. We kind of touched on this, but the fact that actual social housing and local people can actually suffer quite significantly from high carbon tax. Taxing the private sector and bringing that funding back to the local level can help local governments to really offset their emissions that they're struggling with. That's the kind of only scenario where I see offsetting as being generally viable, and it's very much in the short term. I'm sure maybe we'll touch on some of the downsides of carbon tax in the discussion. I know some people think there's issues in terms of carbon leakage, and we've already seen that with our electricity sector in terms of the issue of interconnectors and how we're getting a lot of imported electricity that's very high carbon, but there are potential solutions to that, and I don't think that should push us away from carbon tax, which could really see significant benefits for both our private and our public sector.
Okay.